A millionaire returns from a trip and finds his little daughter working in the cold with injured hands. The stepmother, glass in hand, watches everything without any emotion. What he discovers is shocking. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The snow fell relentlessly over the sprawling estate in Aspen, Colorado, blanketing the pine trees and the vast grounds in a thick layer of white. The winter had arrived with unusual ferocity that year, transforming the luxurious property into a frozen landscape where even the wind seemed to carry a sharp, cutting edge. In the middle of this icy expanse, a small figure moved slowly, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. 8-year-old Emily Carter dragged a heavy bucket of firewood across the snow-covered path, her small hands wrapped in thin gloves that did little to protect her from the biting cold. Her fingers had turned a deep red, and small cracks had begun to appear on her skin, some of them bleeding slightly as she gripped the rough wood. Her face was pale, her lips almost blue, and her eyes held a distant, resigned look that no child her age should ever possess. She had been outside for nearly 3 hours, completing task after task that seemed designed more to exhaust than to accomplish anything meaningful. Chopping kindling, clearing the walkway, organizing the woodshed, carrying supplies from the storage barn to the main house. Each assignment came with precise instructions and the implicit understanding that failure to complete them would result in consequences she had learned to fear. From the covered porch of the main house, a woman watched the scene with an expression of cold detachment. Victoria Ashford Carter sat elegantly in a cushioned chair, a crystal wineglass in her perfectly manicured hand, her posture radiating the kind of effortless superiority that came from years of cultivating an image of refinement. She wore a cashmere sweater in deep burgundy, tailored slacks, and soft leather boots. Her blonde hair was styled in loose waves, and her makeup was flawless despite the early hour. Everything about her spoke of control, precision, and an unwavering sense of entitlement. She took a slow sip of her wine, her gaze never leaving the struggling child in the yard. There was no concern in her eyes, no flicker of compassion or doubt. If anything, there was a faint trace of satisfaction, as though the sight of Emily's suffering confirmed something she had always believed about the natural order of things. Some people were meant to lead, to enjoy comfort and privilege. Others were meant to serve, to endure, to be shaped by hardship into something useful. Victoria had always been in the first category, and she intended to ensure that Emily understood she belonged firmly in the second. The sound of a car engine broke through the stillness of the morning. Victoria's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of annoyance, crossing her features before she composed herself once more. She set down her wineglass and stood, smoothing her sweater as she walked to the edge of the porch. A black SUV pulled into the circular driveway, its tires crunching over the freshly fallen snow. The driver's door opened, and a tall man in a tailored coat stepped out, his dark hair slightly disheveled from the long journey. Jonathan Carter had been away for 3 months, traveling between New York, London, and Singapore to finalize a series of high-stakes acquisitions for his financial firm. The trip had been exhausting, filled with endless meetings, negotiations, and the kind of pressure that came with managing billions of dollars in assets. But now, finally, he was home. He had imagined this moment countless times during his absence. The warmth of the house, the familiar comfort of his own bed, and most importantly, the chance to see his daughter again. Emily had been only 5 when her mother passed, and Jonathan had done his best to provide her with stability and love in the years since. Marrying Victoria had seemed like a logical step, a way to give Emily a maternal figure and to rebuild the family structure that had been shattered by tragedy. But as he looked toward the house now, something felt off. The front entrance had been repainted, the door now a sleek charcoal grey instead of the warm oak finish his late wife had chosen. The planters that used to hold her favorite flowers were gone, replaced by minimalist stone sculptures. Even the wreath on the door was different, modern and geometric, rather than the traditional evergreen his wife had loved. Jonathan frowned, a sense of unease settling over him as he grabbed his luggage from the trunk. Before he could take more than a few steps toward the house, A small movement in the yard caught his attention. He turned and his breath caught in his throat. Emily was there, kneeling in the snow, her small frame hunched over as she struggled to lift a bundle of firewood nearly as large as she was. Her coat was too thin for the weather, and her hands were bare, red and raw from the cold. Jonathan dropped his suitcase and started toward her, his heart pounding. "Emily, sweetheart, what are you doing out here?" His voice was sharp with concern, and Emily looked up, her eyes widening in surprise and something that looked almost like fear. For a moment she seemed frozen, as though unsure whether to run to him or stay where she was. Then, slowly, she stood, her legs trembling slightly. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Jonathan reached her in seconds, kneeling down to her level and pulling her into his arms. She felt so small, so fragile, and he could feel her shivering against him. "Why are you out here? Where's Victoria? Why aren't you inside where it's warm?" Emily didn't answer right. "Away." She glanced toward the porch where Victoria now stood watching them, her expression unreadable. Jonathan followed her gaze and felt a surge of anger. He stood, keeping one hand on Emily's shoulder, and called out to his wife. "Victoria, what's going on? Why is Emily outside in this weather?" Victoria descended the porch steps with measured grace, her heels clicking softly against the stone. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Jonathan, welcome home. I didn't expect you until this evening." "You didn't answer my question," Jonathan said, his voice tight. "Why is my daughter out here doing manual labor in freezing temperatures?" Victoria's smile faded, replaced by a look of mild irritation. "She's learning responsibility, Jonathan. You've been away, so you wouldn't know, but Emily has developed some rather troubling habits. Laziness, defiance, a lack of discipline. I've been working to correct those tendencies by making her work outside in the snow until her hands bleed." Jonathan's voice rose, and he felt Emily flinch beside him. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Don't be dramatic. A little hard work never hurt anyone. In fact, it builds character. You should be thanking me for taking the initiative to raise her properly, while you've been off gallivanting around the world." Jonathan stared at her, disbelief and fury warring within him. "This isn't discipline, Victoria. This is cruelty." Victoria shrugged, her expression cooling further. "If you disagree with my methods, perhaps you should have been here to implement your own, but you weren't. So I did what needed to be done." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked back into the house, leaving Jonathan standing in the snow with Emily trembling beside him. He looked down at his daughter, his heart breaking at the sight of her pale, exhausted face. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you inside and warmed up." As they walked toward the house together, Jonathan's mind raced. Something was very wrong here, and he intended to find out exactly what had been happening in his absence. The house felt different the moment Jonathan stepped inside. It wasn't just the cosmetic changes, the new furniture, the rearranged artwork, the absence of the photographs that used to line the hallway. It was the atmosphere itself, cold and unwelcoming, as though the warmth and life that had once filled these rooms had been deliberately stripped away. He led Emily to the kitchen where he found the housekeeper, Margaret, a kind woman in her 60s who had worked for the family for years. Margaret looked up as they entered, and her expression shifted immediately from surprise to something that looked almost like relief. "Mr. Carter, you're back," she said quietly, her eyes flicking to Emily and then back to Jonathan. "Margaret, can you help Emily get cleaned up and warm?" Jonathan asked, his voice gentle but firm. "And make sure she has something to eat." "Of course," Margaret said, moving quickly to Emily's side. She placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder and led her toward the bathroom, but not before casting a meaningful look back at Jonathan, one that seemed to say, "We need to talk." Jonathan watched them go, his jaw clenched. He turned and walked through the house, taking in the changes with growing unease. In the living room, the mantel that had once displayed family photos now held sleek, modern art pieces. The cozy reading nook his wife had loved was gone, replaced by a minimalist seating area. Even the scent of the house was different, no longer the warm vanilla and cinnamon his wife had favored. but something sharp and floral that made his head ache. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, his footsteps echoing in the silence. When he reached Emily's room, he pushed open the door and felt his stomach drop. The room was bare, almost sterile. The cheerful yellow walls had been repainted a dull beige. The shelves that had once held her toys and books were empty. Her bed was made with plain white linens, and there was no sign of the stuffed animals or drawings that had once filled the space. It looked less like a child's bedroom and more like a guest room in a budget hotel. Jonathan's hands curled into fists. He turned and walked down the hall to the master bedroom, the room he had once shared with his late wife and now shared with Victoria. He pushed open the door and stopped short. The room had been completely transformed. Every trace of his first wife was gone. The photographs, the jewelry box, the small watercolor painting she had loved, all of it had been removed. In their place were Victoria's things, her perfumes, her designer handbags, her framed magazine covers from her brief modeling career. It was as though his first wife had never existed. Jonathan felt a surge of rage so intense it made his vision blur. He turned and stormed back downstairs, finding Victoria in the sitting room, calmly flipping through a fashion magazine. "Where are Sarah's things?" he demanded, his voice shaking. Victoria looked up, her expression one of mild surprise. "Sarah's things? Jonathan, she's been gone for 3 years. It's time to move on." "I didn't ask for your opinion," Jonathan snapped. "I asked where her things are." Victoria sighed, setting down the magazine. "I donated most of it. The rest is in storage. You were holding on to the past, Jonathan, and it wasn't healthy. For you or for Emily, you had no right," Jonathan said, his voice low and dangerous. Victoria stood, her own anger beginning to show. "I had every right. I'm your wife, and this is my home now. I won't live in a shrine to a woman who's no longer here." Jonathan took a step toward her, his fists clenched at his sides. "This was never about Sarah. This is about control. You've erased her, isolated Emily, and turned this house into something unrecognizable, and I want to know why." Victoria's eyes flashed. "Because you were never going to do it yourself. You were too busy mourning, too busy working, too busy being absent. Someone had to take charge, and that someone was me." Before Jonathan could respond, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression anxious. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think you should know something." Jonathan turned to her, his anger giving way to concern. "What is it, Margaret?" Margaret glanced at Victoria, then back at Jonathan. "It's about Emily. There are things that have been happening while you were away. Things you need to know about." Victoria's expression hardened. "Margaret, I don't think this is the time." Margaret ignored her, her gaze fixed on Jonathan. "She's been treated very poorly, Mr. Carter. I've tried to intervene, but I was told to mind my own business. If I didn't need this job, I would have spoken up sooner. But I'm telling you now because I can't stay silent anymore." Jonathan felt a cold dread settle over him. "Tell me everything." And so, as the snow continued to fall outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Margaret began to speak, and with every word, Jonathan's world shifted further off its axis. Margaret's words fell like stones into still water, each one creating ripples that spread wider and wider, until Jonathan felt as though he were drowning in them. She spoke of meals denied, of punishments that lasted for hours, of Emily being forced to sleep in the cold because Victoria claimed she needed to learn resilience. She described how Victoria had dismissed the tutors Jonathan had hired, claiming Emily was too difficult to teach, and had instead assigned her endless chores that kept her isolated and exhausted. She told him about the visitors who came late at night, business associates of Victoria's, who spoke in hushed tones about contracts and transfers and legal maneuvers that Margaret didn't fully understand but knew were wrong. And she told him about the fear in Emily's eyes, the way the child had learned to move silently through the house, to make herself invisible, to never ask for anything because asking only brought more pain. By the time Margaret finished, Jonathan felt as though he had aged a decade. He sat heavily in one of the chairs, his head in his hands, trying to process the enormity of what he had just heard. Victoria had left the room at some point during Margaret's account, retreating upstairs without a word. Jonathan was grateful for her absence. He wasn't sure he could look at her without doing something he would regret. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I know it wasn't easy." Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That little girl deserves better, Mr. Carter. She's been through so much, and she's still so sweet, so gentle. But she's breaking, I can see it." Jonathan looked up, his jaw set with determination. "She won't break. I won't let that happen. I'm going to fix this, Margaret, I promise you." Margaret gave him a small, sad smile. "I hope so, Mr. Carter. I truly do." After Margaret left to check on Emily, Jonathan sat alone in the dimly lit room, his mind racing. He needed to understand the full scope of what had been happening. He needed evidence, not just Margaret's testimony, but concrete proof that he could use to protect Emily and to ensure that Victoria could never hurt her again. He stood and walked to his study, a room that had once been his sanctuary, but now felt foreign and unwelcoming. The furniture had been rearranged and several of his personal items were missing. He moved to his desk and began opening drawers, searching for anything that might give him insight into Victoria's activities. It was in the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of old financial reports, that he found the first clue. A small, locked compartment that he didn't remember installing. He frowned, examining the lock. It was new, the wood around it still fresh. Someone had added this recently, and he had a sinking feeling he knew who. He searched the desk for a key but found nothing. Frustrated, he grabbed a letter opener and carefully pried at the lock until it gave way with a soft click. Inside the compartment was a manila envelope, worn and creased as though it had been handled many times. Jonathan pulled it out and opened it, his hands trembling slightly. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all written in a child's careful handwriting. He recognized Emily's script immediately, the way she formed her letters with such concentration, the little hearts she drew in the corners of the page. He pulled out the first letter and began to read. "Dear Daddy, I miss you so much. Victoria says you're very busy and that I shouldn't bother you, but I wanted to write to you anyway. I hope you're having a good trip. I've been trying to be good, but Victoria says I'm not trying hard enough. She says I need to work harder and complain less. I'm trying, Daddy, I really am. I love you. Please come home soon. Emily." Jonathan's vision blurred as he read letter after letter, each one more heartbreaking than the last. Emily wrote about being hungry, about being cold, about being scared. She wrote about missing her mother, about wishing she could talk to her father, about hoping that things would get better when he came home. And in every letter she apologized, as though somehow all of this were her fault. The final letter was dated just 2 weeks ago. "Dear Daddy, I don't think you're getting my letters. I've been leaving them in places where I thought you might find them, but you haven't come home yet, so maybe you didn't see them. Or maybe you did see them and you're angry with me. Victoria says you agree with her about how I should be raised. She says you told her to be strict with me because I'm difficult. I don't want to be difficult, Daddy. I'm trying so hard to be good. But I'm so tired, and my hands hurt, and I don't understand why everything has to be so hard. I still love you even if you're angry with me. I hope you come home soon. Emily." Jonathan's hands shook as he set the letter down. Victoria had intercepted every single one. She had hidden them, kept them from him, and then lied to Emily, telling her that he didn't care, that he approved of the way she was being treated. It was a level of cruelty he could barely comprehend. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and began searching the rest of the study with renewed urgency. If Victoria had hidden the letters, what else had she hidden? It didn't take long to find the diary. It was tucked behind a framed photograph of Victoria, one that had replaced a picture of Jonathan's late wife. The photograph itself was positioned in such a way that the diary was completely concealed, visible only if you removed the frame from the wall. Jonathan pulled it down and opened the small, cloth-bound book. The entries were brief, written in Emily's careful hand, and they painted a picture of systematic abuse that made Jonathan's blood run cold. Victoria had been methodical in her cruelty, carefully calibrating her punishments to avoid leaving obvious marks, isolating Emily from anyone who might help her, and ensuring that the child believed she deserved everything that was happening to her. But it was the final entry that made Jonathan's heart stop. Today, I heard Victoria talking on the phone. She didn't know I was in the hallway. She was talking to someone about Daddy's company. She said something about papers and signatures and how everything would be theirs soon. I don't understand what it means, but it scared me. I wish Daddy were here. Jonathan's mind raced. He moved to his filing cabinet and began pulling out documents, financial statements, corporate records, anything related to his business. It took him nearly an hour, but eventually he found what he was looking for. Buried among routine paperwork were several documents he didn't recognize: transfer agreements, power of attorney, forms amendments to the corporate charter, all bearing his signature. Except he had never signed them. He examined the signatures closely, comparing them to his genuine signature on other documents. They were good, nearly perfect, but there were subtle differences, small inconsistencies that revealed them as forgeries. Someone had been systematically forging his signature, creating a paper trail that would allow them to take control of his company. And he had a terrible suspicion about who that someone was. He grabbed his phone and dialed his attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Reeves, who had been a close friend of his late wife. She answered on the second ring. "Jonathan, I was wondering when you'd call. I've been trying to reach you for weeks." "Patricia, I need you to tell me everything," Jonathan said, his voice tight. "What's been happening with the company?" There was a pause, and then Patricia's voice came back, carefully controlled. "Jonathan, where are you right now?" "I'm at home." "Why?" "Because you need to listen to me very carefully. Do not let Victoria know that you're aware of anything unusual. Do not confront her, and do not sign anything she puts in front of you." Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. "Patricia, what's going on? Your company is being stolen, Jonathan. Victoria and a man claiming to be her brother have been working together to forge documents, manipulate board members, and create a legal framework that would allow them to seize control of your assets. They've been siphoning money into offshore accounts, and they've convinced several key shareholders that you're mentally unstable and unfit to run the company. If you hadn't come back when you did, they would have had you declared incompetent within the month." Jonathan felt as though the floor had dropped, out from beneath him. "How long have you known?" "I started noticing irregularities about 6 weeks ago," Patricia said. "I've been gathering evidence, but I needed to be careful. These people are dangerous, Jonathan. They've covered their tracks well, and they have powerful connections. I was going to contact you as soon as I had enough proof to take to the authorities." Jonathan closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. "I need to get Emily out of here, tonight." "I agree," Patricia said, "but you need to be smart about this. If Victoria realizes you're onto her, she'll accelerate her plans. You need to act normal, wait until she's asleep, and then leave quietly. I have a safe place you can go. An old colleague of your wife's has a cabin in the mountains, completely off the grid. You can stay there while we build our case." Jonathan nodded, even though Patricia couldn't see him. "Okay, I'll do it." "And Jonathan," Patricia added, her voice softening, "I'm sorry. I know this is a lot to take in. Thank you, Patricia, for everything." After he hung up, Jonathan sat in silence for a long moment, trying to process everything he had learned. His wife, the woman he had trusted, had been systematically abusing his daughter and conspiring to steal everything he had built. It was almost too much to believe. But he didn't have time to fall apart. Emily needed him, and he wasn't going to fail her again. He spent the rest of the evening acting as normally as possible, enduring a tense dinner during which Victoria made polite conversation as though nothing were wrong. Emily sat silently at the table, barely touching her food, her eyes downcast. Jonathan wanted to reach out to her to tell her that everything was going to be okay, but he forced himself to wait. After dinner, he told Victoria he was exhausted from his trip and was going to bed early. She smiled, that cold, perfect smile, and told him to sleep well. He went upstairs, waited until he heard her retire to her own room, and then moved quickly and quietly. He packed a small bag with essentials, then went to Emily's room. She was awake, sitting on her bed in the darkness, her arms wrapped around her knees. "Sweetheart," he whispered, kneeling beside her, "we're leaving. Right now." Emily's eyes widened. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe," Jonathan said. "But we have to be very quiet, okay? Can you do that for me?" Emily nodded, and Jonathan helped her pack a few belongings. Then, moving as silently as shadows, they crept downstairs. Margaret was waiting for them in the kitchen, a bag already packed. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly. "That child needs someone who knows how to take care of her, and you're going to need all the help you can get." Jonathan didn't argue. Together, the three of them slipped out into the cold night and climbed into Jonathan's car. He started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, his heart pounding as he watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror. They drove for hours, winding through mountain roads, until they reached the cabin Patricia had told him about. It was small and rustic, but it was warm and safe, and that was all that mattered. Over the next few days, Jonathan worked with Patricia to gather evidence. The old babysitter, a kind woman named Helen, who had been dismissed by Victoria months ago, came forward with her own testimony. Security footage from the house, which Jonathan had forgotten existed, revealed the extent of Emily's suffering. And then there was the teddy bear. Emily had brought it with her, a worn, beloved toy that had been a gift from her mother. Jonathan hadn't thought much of it until Emily shyly told him that it could record sounds. She had placed it on a shelf in the main hallway, and it had captured hours of Victoria's phone conversations, including detailed discussions of the financial scheme and thinly veiled threats against anyone who might interfere. The recordings were damning, and Patricia immediately turned them over to the FBI. The investigation moved quickly after that. Agents descended on the estate, seizing documents and freezing accounts. Victoria's so-called brother, a man named Marcus Hale, attempted to flee the country, but was apprehended at the airport. Victoria herself tried to fight back, giving tearful interviews in which she claimed Jonathan had suffered a breakdown and kidnapped Emily. But the evidence was overwhelming, and public opinion quickly turned against her. The breaking point came when Emily disappeared from the cabin. Jonathan had stepped outside for just a few minutes to speak with an FBI agent, and when he returned, she was gone. Footprints in the snow led into the woods, and Jonathan's heart nearly stopped. He followed the trail, calling her name, until he reached a small, hidden cabin deep in the trees. Inside, he found Victoria holding Emily by the arm, her expression a mixture of desperation and fury. "Let her go," Jonathan said, his voice deadly calm. Victoria laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you can just take everything from me and walk away." "This isn't about you, Victoria," Jonathan said. "This is about a little girl who deserves to be safe and loved, something you clearly don't understand." Before Victoria could respond, the door burst open, and FBI agents flooded the room. Victoria was arrested on the spot, her protests falling on deaf ears as she was led away in handcuffs. Emily ran to Jonathan, and he scooped her up, holding her tightly as she cried into his shoulder. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of the conspiracy was revealed. Victoria and Marcus had stolen millions, forged countless documents, and manipulated dozens of people. They were both sentenced to lengthy prison terms, and Jonathan's company was restored to his control. But more importantly, Emily began to heal. With the help of a skilled therapist, she slowly started to open up, to trust again, to believe that she was safe. Jonathan created a foundation in his late wife's name, dedicated to helping children who had suffered abuse and neglect. Emily, now older and stronger, became involved in the project, using her own experience to help others. The foundation grew rapidly, becoming a beacon of hope for countless families. On Emily's 10th birthday, Jonathan stood in the courtyard of the foundation's main facility, watching as children laughed and played in the snow. Emily stood beside him, her hand in his, and for the first time in years he felt truly at peace. "You know," Emily said quietly, "I used to hate the snow. It reminded me of being cold and scared. But now, when I see it, I think about new beginnings." Jonathan smiled, squeezing her hand. "That's exactly what it is, sweetheart. A new beginning. For all of us." And as the snow continued to fall, soft and gentle, Jonathan knew that they had finally found their way home.